As we are continuing our study in the Gospel of John, we are in the larger block here. The Lord Jesus is examined before Pilate. That's 1828 through the first part of 1916. In verse 24, we read that the Lord Jesus was brought to Caiaphas, but John doesn't tell us what happened there. Matthew 26, 57 through 68, Mark 14, 53 to 65, and Luke 22, 66 through 71 all tell of that trial before Caiaphas. There is not the slightest indication of what happened in front of Caiaphas or how the Lord Jesus answered. Perhaps for John and the other Jews, his Jewish readers, that conversation was less interesting, for Caiaphas was only high priest in name only. He was the high priest appointed by the Romans, and the Jews really didn't care about that. For them, Annas was the high priest. We understand that the council described in those passages, the hearing in those passages, was a mere formality. The real decision had been made well before that. For instance, after the account of their response to Lazarus' resurrection in 1153, we read, "From that day they plotted so that they might kill him." So now here we have verses 18, 28 through 32. This is the initial interaction between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. But in order to keep this video reasonably brief, we will artificially divide this unit into two parts, verses 28, 29, 30, and then another video that covers 31 to 32. So this video is about 28 to 30, which introduces the setting and gives Governor Pilate's first question and the frustrated response of the Jewish leaders. According to Bruce, in his New Testament history, there are three sources of information about this governor, Pontius Pilate. The New Testament, of course, Josephus, and also a letter from Agrippa, who was the son of Herod the Great, to the Emperor Gaius. Pontius Pilate was appointed governor of Judea in 26 AD, and he held that position until 36 AD. His Latin title was Praefectus Iudea. Now a little bit about Judea. Judea was ruled by Herod the Great's son, Archelaus. That's in Matthew 2:22. Until Archelaus was banished in 6 AD by the Emperor Augustus. Why? Because he was ruining Judea. And Augustus feared that he would stir up too much anti-Roman hatred. In that same year, AD 6, Judea became a province of Rome. So a praefectus, or procurator, became governor. Those appointed as governors over small provinces such as Judea were drawn from the lower Roman nobility. Those of high nobility could become governors of large provinces. Likewise, only second-class troops, not the famous Roman legions, were stationed in these smaller provinces like Judea. If the more powerful and well-trained legions were needed, they would be sent from Syria, as was the case in AD 36, 52, and 66. Interesting story about Emperor Tiberius. He allowed provincial governors to serve for long periods of time, and when asked why he differed from the normal practice and allowed these provincial governors to stay in power for a long period, he answered with a parable about a man who was injured, bleeding, lying on the side of the road, covered in flies, sucking his blood. This is really the story from Emperor Tiberius. These flies are sucking this man's blood, and when passers-by wanted to shoo away the flies, the injured man begged them, "Leave the flies alone." He said, "These flies are full of my blood, and they don't bother me much. But if they were driven away and replaced by hungry flies, I would definitely die. And that story is recorded by Bruce in his New Testament history. That's an interesting perspective about a Roman emperor, about his governors in these provinces. Through several incidents, we can see that Pontius Pilate was often very insensitive to the religious situation in Jerusalem, to the point that the people of Jerusalem nearly rioted due to his actions several times. Several times he was too drastic and he had to back down. If you're interested, here's some historical events that tell us more about this man, Pontius Pilate, and his leadership failures. From Bruce, again, in his book, New Testament History. According to Josephus, one night, Pilate brought military banners decorated with the emperor's image into his palace in Jerusalem to be installed there. In the morning, the people very strongly objected to those banners, thinking that the images violated the Torah. Finally, Pilate withdrew the banners and avoided riots that would have been probably throughout all Judea. Agrippa's letter tells how Pilate installed shields covered with gold in his palace in Jerusalem. Once again, the people objected. They asked the shields be taken down. Pilate refused to back down. So they sent a message to Emperor Tiberius, who ordered Pilate to move the shields to the Temple of Augustus in Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Josephus also tells us about how Pilate built an aqueduct so that the city of Jerusalem would not lack water. The project, of course, was very expensive. And Pilate demanded that the temple treasury pay for the project. And Pilate considered this appropriate because the temple needed a lot of water because of the sacrifices that were slaughtered there. The temple leadership refused, but Pilate used troops to seize the funds from the temple treasury. Once, after Pilate's troops killed many Samaritans that were gathered to worship on Mount Gerizim, Pilate was summoned to Rome to account for his actions. It seems that Pilate failed to impress the emperor, for he was then replaced by a man named Marullus. And Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, says that Pilate committed suicide. Those few stories tell us about a man who was bold but unwise in his actions. That's the Pilate that we read about here in these events. In the trial of Jesus, Pilate tried to find a compromise between the Jewish leaders and the Lord Jesus, who was clearly in the right and who certainly did not pose a threat to Roman rule. And that was really all Pilate cared about, is stop insurrections and keep Rome in control. The Jewish authorities that clearly hated the Lord Jesus, they actually threatened the very political stability that Pilate had to guard. Culpeper says that Pilate is used by John to show us that compromise is impossible in the Christian life. Culpeper may indeed be correct in this, but let us not conclude from that that Pilate and his attempted compromise are fictional. No, this account is historically accurate, and it also brings that spiritual lesson to the mind of the reader. These things really happened. They're accurately recorded by John, and these are a reminder that spiritual compromise is impossible. Chapter 18, verse 28. So they lead Jesus from Caiaphas into the official residence of the governor. Now it was early, and they did not go into the official residence so that they would not be defiled, so that they might eat the Passover. As discussed in an earlier video, the parts of this section that tell about the Lord Jesus begin with the word un, here translated so. Now, about the word here translated the official residence of the governor, this Greek word praetorion comes from the Latin word praetorium, which referred to the official residence of a Roman military governor such as Pilate. Carson explains that the praetorian was normally in Caesarea, and for that you might refer to Acts 23, 33, 34, 35. But whenever the governor went to Jerusalem, his official residence there would be called the praetorian. Perhaps Pilate's praetorium in Jerusalem was the Antonia fortress outside the northwest corner of the temple court. And we have photos of a model of Jerusalem. Here's a photo showing the temple, and on the left there you can see the 4 square towers of the Antonia fortress. And here's a zoomed in photo, just those 4 square towers of the Antonia fortress. Again, this is a model. It's called the Holy Land Hotel model, now located in a museum in Jerusalem. That's one possibility for the location of Pilate's praetorium. The other possibility is that, well, Herod the Great built a palace on the western wall, and that palace had these high towers. And so in this photo, well, you can see that round tower near the center and near the upper part of the photo. That's a mosque's prayer tower. But underneath that round-shaped tower, you see that block-shaped tower, not much, only a little higher than the wall. That's the base. That's what remains of one of the towers of Herod the Great's palace built into the wall there. That might also be the location of Herod's praetorium in Jerusalem. This Greek word, praetorium, is used twice in this verse and in 1833 and 19:9. It's also found in Matthew 27:27, Mark 15:16, Acts 23:35, and Philippians 1:13. Now back to our verse. Now it was early, and they did not go into the official residence. The term early is proi. It's difficult to interpret, actually. For the Romans, the 4th and last night watch is called the proi, and Mounts and Carson tell us about that. But outside the Roman context, that same term had the usual meaning of just early morning, after sunrise. Carson prefers this simpler meaning. It's just early morning. Roman officials usually started work at sunrise and finished at 10 or 11 a.m. So it's not surprising that they spoke early in the morning with Pilate. 1828 continues, so that they would not be defiled, so that they might eat the Passover. Well, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Lord Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover. But according to this verse, the Jewish religious leaders did not want to defile themselves because they wanted to eat the Passover. Is this a contradiction? Well, again, according to Carson, the expression eat the Passover usually refers to the Passover meal described in chapter 13, but this expression can also refer to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why is that? Well, we don't really know why, and we don't really need to know why eat the Passover can refer to the celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But the fact is, in Luke 22:1, we read, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, called the Passover, was drawing near. That verse, Luke 22:1, equates the two feasts so that the term Passover in this verse could also refer to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was beginning at that time. They did not want to be defiled, lest they be unable to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we can read about the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Exodus 23:15 and, well, also 2 Chronicles 30:21. Let me read Exodus 23:15. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. It is unclear what level of defilement the Jewish leaders were concerned about, but contact with a corpse would, according to Numbers 9, 7 through 10, and 19:11, and 19:16, and 31:19, would render them unclean for 7 days. Carson, again, notes that in Oholot, in the Mishnah, it says that sometime in this time period, the Jews believed that Gentiles buried aborted fetuses under their houses or flushed them down their drains. That was a rumor that they believed. Was it true? We don't know. And so going into a house like that, they felt would render them defiled for 7 days. Well, Carson further explains that concerning the Jews thinking about how they would be defiled if they entered the residence, the evidence, Carson says, the evidence is complex and the matter not certainly resolved. Well, we don't really need to know the technical details about why they felt they would be defiled and for how long they would be defiled. What we understand is they didn't want to go into Pilate's residence because they thought that that would be defiling. Okay. Having all those Jewish leaders unable to participate in the activities of that Holy Week, that would have been a major problem for them. From a few verses in the Bible, we get the impression that the chief priests were present at the time of the trial. That's Matthew 27:12, Mark 15:3, and Luke 23:1 through 5. We have the impression that the chief priests were present at the time of the trial. Maybe they were in the yard, the courtyard, but they didn't go into the official residence. They were very careful not to violate their interpretation of the law. Yet, they were not so concerned about the problem of truth. Their hypocrisy is obvious. Also, as Carson, citing a man named Dodd, points out, their unwillingness to enter Pilate's residence sends Pilate scuttling back and forth, acting on 2 stages, as it were, a front stage and a rear stage. Very interesting. The physical action that Pilate has to go out to the courtyard, back to talk to Jesus, back and forth. It kind of paints a physical feature of the struggle that Pilate was having, trying to find his way between these Jewish leaders and that rabbi. And then further, Carson cites a man named Duke saying that this, quote, portrays the human predicament in which one must choose between Jesus and the world. Chapter 18, verse 29. So Pilate went out to them and he said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Verses 29, 33, 38 tell how Pilate moved physically between the Lord Jesus and the Jewish leaders. He also walked back and forth between light and darkness, between truth and lies, between acquitting and condemning the Lord Jesus. We understand that Pilate was not very sensitive about Judaism, but here he is willing to trouble himself about this matter. Even so, we shall read that his willingness had its limits. When Pilate asked the question, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" he opened an official hearing. He must have understood a little about what they actually wanted. His soldiers were involved in the Lord Jesus' arrest, but Pilate was not willing to just accept their decision and will and allow the death penalty. The smile on Pontius Pilate's face was almost visible. He seemed to be thinking, "These Jews have always been giving me a hard time. Now I have an opportunity to give them a hard time." But he had to follow official procedure. As with any trial, what happened at this trial would be recorded, and those records would be put in an official file, which might be read by the emperor. Pilate was on guard against any future criticism by those who wanted to overthrow him. Chapter 18, verse 30. They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not hand him over to you. This word hand him over is paradidomi. 8 times this word paradidomi is used regarding Judas. In those passages, it's better translated betray. Now the word paradidomi, or hand over, is used by the Jews of their own action. So does this perhaps indicate that the burden of Judas' guilt seems to shift to the Jewish religious leaders? There might be some indication of that. Interesting. Now, they were surprised, and clearly there's a tone of frustration in their voices. They were saying something like, why do we need an official hearing? Just accept the outcome of our decision. Given this frustration, their dangerous rudeness to the Roman governor was understandable. At first, they had hoped that Pilate would just support their decision. Perhaps they thought that that hope was justified. After all, Pilate's troops were used to arrest this, according to them, troublesome rabbi. But they did not have a strong enough accusation or a strong enough case to bring a verdict that they'd hoped for, so they can only just give a general statement. Oh, if he were not an evildoer, we wouldn't be here. Well, that's not a legal argument. Implied in that general statement was a request for Pilate to just accept their decision and not go through this formal court hearing. Well, by way of summary, verses 28 through 30 introduce the setting, the praetorium, or official residence of the military governor, and gives Governor Pilate's first question and the frustrated response of the Jewish leaders.